What's up, guys? Ballin With Blizzy back with another video for Circa Survivor Week 4. We're going to take a look back at the Week 3 recap, the eliminations, what went right, what went wrong, and then we're going to jump ahead, look at strategy for Week 4, and I'm going to give you my selection. So let's start by taking a look back at Week 3. So as you can see here, the recap for Week 3, the largest percentage of eliminations to date. Week 1, Week 2, mostly went according to plan for most people, as long as you stayed on the heavy favorites. Week 3 was the first time that we saw two pretty significant favorites lose their matchups. So the Seahawks were the number one pick. 40% of people got through. The Bills, they played on Thursday night. When I talked last Saturday, they had already gotten through and beaten the Dolphins. Bucks narrowly on a last-second drive and a field goal by Chase McLaughlin. They got through for another 2,000 folks, 2,000 entries, I should say. And then the Packers squandered a 10-0 lead mid-fourth quarter and lost 13-10 on that crazy ending with a blocked field goal and a 55-yard field goal for the Browns. Falcons, it was never close. Shutout. Michael Penix did not look great. Panthers offense didn't have to do much because their defense was carrying the load, and they won 30-0. So over 3,000 people eliminated in Week 3. If you stayed off of those two teams, you're in good shape, especially if you used the Seahawks and you didn't use the Bills and even the Bucks, who I think we mentioned last week are going to have home games against, of course, the Saints and the Panthers. So 13,811 are moving on to Week 4. And what are those folks going to be doing? What am I going to be doing? What am I going to be suggesting? Let's jump over to the Circa Survivor data grid on Pool Genius and kind of take a look at what the situation is this week. So, of course, Buffalo, very, very, very heavy favorites. Minus 1,600 on the money line, 15-point favorites. A lot of people have them available if they didn't use them last week, and they're not going to lose, right? I mean, it's the NFL, anything can happen, but if you just want to get your entry through, Buffalo's your team this week. Don't look further. You don't care about future value. You just want a team that's going to win this week, and you want to get your bullet to Week 5. You got to go Buffalo, right? New Orleans, short week, flying cross country. Well, not short week, but just shorter week than Buffalo, flying cross country. Buffalo's been at home since the previous Thursday night after their win against the Dolphins. So Buffalo, perfectly viable option, right? Perfectly viable option. Detroit, home against Cleveland, 10-point favorites. They are coming off a short week, actually. They played Monday night in Baltimore, traveling back to Detroit. Cleveland has an extra day of rest. Cleveland has a pretty good defense, but this is most likely, except for the game against the Giants later on this season, this is most likely Detroit's heaviest favorite on the spread spot. Only thing is about them, they play on both holidays. Denver, I'm not going to talk about them because I already recommended them Week 1 on this channel. So for our purposes, they are eliminated. If for some reason you did not use them Week 1, this is certainly going to be their heaviest favorite, it looks like, as Pool Genius is projecting the rest of the year at 7.5, minus 440 on the money line. So perfectly reasonable spot and probably a good spot to use Denver if you have them. Houston, they're in consideration for me. They're at home against the Titans. Titans have been struggling. Callahan might already be getting fired in, just a little over one season in on that job. We'll circle back to them in a little while. Green Bay at Dallas, not the spot for me. Green Bay has a couple more winnable games coming up. This is a winnable game. They're 6.5-point favorites, minus 330 on the money line, but not the spot for me on the road in Dallas. Chargers at Giants, perfectly reasonable spot to use the Chargers, 6.5-point favorites. But again, for me, Chargers, this isn't quite the right spot. They've got a couple other spots that I prefer later on in the season. New England, they're at home against Carolina. I think this is an interesting spot because New England is coming off a home loss. Carolina is coming off a resounding win, but Carolina didn't really do much offensively. New England's been stout, especially against the run. They've been a little shaky against the pass, but Bryce Young's not really threatening people through the air right now. He's also going to be missing Xavier Legette. Jalen Coker still on IR, of course. So they're running with the cast of Tet McMillan, who looks like he will play with the calf. He's questionable. And then Hunter Renfrow. Also for Bryce Young, he's missing Jatavian Sanders. So that's another pass game weapon not at his disposal. Rams, Indianapolis, 3.5. San Francisco, 3.5. Philadelphia, 3.5. Miami, 3. Not really any of the spots that I want to go to past these top 7. So let's jump over to the season planner and we can really dial in on what I am projecting to do. Let's start with my entry number 1, because this is the picks that I've been recommending to you all. We got through with Denver against the Titans. We got through with Baltimore at home against Cleveland. And we cruised last week, Seattle at home against the Saints. So if we sort by projected win percentage in this week, we can kind of really narrow down what I'm talking about. So yes, largest spot for any team to be favored all year is this spot right here. The question is, there's a number of other teams that you can go with this week. Whereas some weeks, there's not going to be this many good teams to choose from. Like I think week 10 is one of them, right? Is it week? Yeah, it's week 10 and week 11, I think, for me. But week 10, let's focus in on that. So if let's say you don't use Buffalo this week, you can use them next week. But let's just say you don't have them, right? This week 10, we've already used Denver. Then really you're talking about nobody more than a 67% favorite. So that's where you get into, you kind of need to forecast. Yes, it doesn't matter if you're forecasting, if your team doesn't get through this week, totally understand that logic. But for all intents and purposes, if you lose in week 4 and you lose in week 10, it's the same thing, right? You're in the exact same spot. You didn't clear out all 20 picks. You were out the same as people who lost in week 4. So that's kind of where I am in terms of looking ahead. And that's kind of what you'll notice when we kind of hone in on who I'm rolling with this week. So I'm not going to be rolling Buffalo. I'm going to take a stand that I'm going to get through this week and that we can use them either next week or even at Carolina or whatever the case may be. Denver, not an option for us this week. Detroit, as I mentioned, they're going to have one really, really big favorite home game against the Giants. And then they play on Thanksgiving and they play on Christmas. Now, they're not really the team that I'm looking to use on those days, but really not a bad idea to keep them at least until this week 12 spot where we have a better idea what teams are looking like for that Thursday Thanksgiving slate, right? If you get here and it still looks the same as it is, you're not really sure about Detroit, Green Bay, you're still not really sure about Detroit, Minnesota. This is really the spot that you make that final decision, I think, is right here. You keep Detroit up until week 12. So they're out for me. Houston, in play for me. 7.5-point favorites at home against the Titans. Green Bay, like I mentioned, not in play. And like I said, they have, better opportunities where they're going to be larger favorites in this week, and they're all at home. Home against Jake Browning. Home against Bryce Young. Home against the Bears, all right? So not the spot for me here. Chargers, I mentioned. Why I don't want to use them. There's some better spots for them. Again, I mentioned week 10. If you roll up to week 10 and you've used Buffalo and Denver, Chargers are going to be your most likely team to win. And then also with the Chargers, they play on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. So that slate, they're going to be the largest favorite, 74%, the Chargers here. And then also if we take a look at the Sunday after Christmas, biggest favorite here. So this is not the spot you want to be using the Chargers, especially because, it's just a wild card. The team could get juiced up. Weird things could happen. Jackson Dart's making his debut. So, again, they're probably going to win. I would pick them to win if forced, but I think there's going to be a better spot week 13, week 10, and week 17. So we trickle on down here, really to the last team that I'm considering. Not using Buffalo, not using Detroit, already used Denver, not using Green Bay, not using LA. Brings us to the New England Patriots. So for the Patriots, they're in play for me, right? They're not really going to be this large of a favorite, 5.5 points, nearly 70%. Again, I like the narrative that Carolina kind of coasted 30-0 and people are high on them right now. New England is coming off a loss at home. But I think if you really diagnose the way that game was won for Carolina, it was because their offense didn't have to do much. Their defense carried. Now, if their defense carries again, New England might be in trouble, right? But New England's at home. They have a good defense. They're really, really solid against the run. And if they can keep the run game for the Panthers in check and Bryce Young is forced to throw, that's kind of where you want to be. Bryce Young has not proven himself to be a consistent weapon through the air, a top flight quarterback that's really going to carve you apart. I think last week I heard a stat that the Panthers were like only the second team to win in a shutout when their offense, I think, produced like less than 150 yards fewer than the opponent or something like that. So again, they're not really moving the ball. Just last week was the case where their defense just stood up and shut down the Atlanta Falcons offense. So that leaves me between the Patriots and the Texans, right? I've been going back and forth all week. It's really tough for me. I think ultimately what I've leaned on, you see here 75%, 69%. I think both of them have very little future value. So for me, I'm just trusting in the market, right? 75% on Pool Genius, 77% according to the sports books, whereas we're down 69 and 69. So I don't want to give that equity up. I think New England's a perfectly reasonable play. I will be playing them in my portfolio, but in terms of my pick officially for this week, again, if you have been following my picks and you're rolling with my picks, I'm definitely recommending on this entry, and will be using on this entry, the Houston Texans. I just think, once again, preserves future value. They're 7.5-point favorites. They're at home. They've been in every game. Barely lost season opener at the Rams. Lost on a last-second drive to Baker Mayfield. And then last week it was 10-10, and they just had a busted coverage against Brian Thomas Jr., and things kind of fell apart. So it's a tough week. Can, obviously make a case for a number of different directions. If you just want to get through, fully encourage you to just roll the Buffalo Bills. You can also roll the Detroit Lions. But I think if people are going to get through, if you're going to get through 20 weeks, there's going to be weeks like this where you slide down from the top two favorites that you might want to use later in the season, especially next week where Buffalo is really going to be the strongest favorite once again. And you just, you pick your spots. 7.5-point favorites at home, the Texans. You're not going to find a better spot. If they lose, that's unfortunate. But there's some weeks where we're going to be picking teams where nobody's a 7.5-point favorite. So I'm trying not to get caught up in the fact that Buffalo's a 15-point favorite, Detroit's a 10-point favorite. It's like, look, this is a great spot for the Texans. I'm not going to use them later on in the season. And most weeks you're happy if you can roll a home favorite of 7.5 points. So I'm recommending the Texans for you all this week. I'm rolling the Texans on that entry that we've been tracking along this channel. If you disagree, if you want to tell me who you're rolling with, if you want to tell me that there's another direction you're going this week, let me know in the comments below. Good luck, and hopefully I'm talking to you guys again soon next week.